Greetings, everyone. My name is David Pettyjohn. I am the Executive Director of the Idaho Humanities Council. I want to thank each of you for joining us this evening for another one of our connected conversations. Before I kind of introduce our speakers, I would like to, first of all, remind each of you that we will have a question and answer session. Also would like to remind you that this is just one of the many programs that we offer here at the Idaho Humanities Council. And if you're not familiar with our work, I encourage you to go to our website, which is idahohumanities.org. So tonight we are going to learn about Archie Boyd Teater, Art, Architecture, Artifacts, and Archives. What a name. And joining us tonight is Chelsea Boehm, Lester Taylor, and Henry Whiting. And they'll each say a little bit about themselves. So I will now turn it over to Chelsea. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you, David. I'm Chelsea. I am a public historian. I currently work for the Idaho State Historical Society at the Idaho State Museum.
Henry, why don't you start?
Well, I'm Henry Whiting. I am the owner of Teeter's Knoll, and I'm looking forward to talking to everybody. I'll introduce myself more comprehensively in a little bit when I get started here.
Okay, I'm Lester Taylor, and I don't know whether you're supposed to do it this way or not, but I'm talking to you from my library in Tucson, Arizona. And although I have written a book about Archie Teeter, but I'm not an artist, I'm not an art historian, I'm not an art critic, I'm an economist. And I look forward to talking with Henry and Chelsea about Archie and his art.
All right, thank you all very much. So Chelsea, I think we'll kind of turn it over to you now to kind of lead the discussion.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Chelsea. I am presenting this evening, or I'm participating this evening from Boise, which is the ancestral homeland of the Shoshone-Bannock people. So before we begin, I want to pay my respect to the members of that tribe, both past and present. So a little bit of a summary about how tonight's gonna go. I am going to turn the time over first to Lester, and he's going to tell us about Archie Teeter's life and his art. And then Henry is going to talk about Teeter's Knoll. And then I will follow up at the end with just a brief bit about the archival collection, the Archie and Patricia Teeter archival collection at the Idaho State Archives, and some of the artifacts at the Idaho State Museum. So let me share my screen. Oh, can I have permission to share my screen? So, Lester, to begin, can you tell us a little bit about Archie and his early life?
Certainly, thanks, Chelsea. Archie was born in 1901 in Boise, and he grew up in southeastern Idaho, much of it in Boise, and a lot of it also in the Hagerman Valley along the Snake River. And in this slide, we see Archie's father, Peter Boyd Teater, and his mother, Maddie Teeter. And Archie, there were five children, 3 boys and 2 girls. And in this slide, we have Archie and his 2 brothers. Archie is the one in the center there. And Archie spent much of his schooling years in Boise, and much of his teenage years he was along the Snake River in the Hagerman Valley. And the family was in general a very poor one, and Archie really didn't get through 8th grade. But as he put it, he was requested to leave 8th grade because he was doodling rather than doing his mathematics. but at a very early age, and he's probably 12, 13 years old. He saw a artist one time that was in I guess they called him a Buckeye artist, in a drugstore in Boise, and he was painting portraits and other things. And Archie decided right then and there that he wanted to become an artist. But in his teenage years, he spent much of his time working in logging camps in Idaho, or excuse me, in Oregon, and along the Snake River, in gold mining camps in the Hagerman Valley. And he started painting in his teens, but he didn't have any formal art instruction until 1921, when he went to the Portland Art Museum in Portland. And in this slide, it shows a picture of him in Portland at that time. And he spent 2 winters studying art at the Portland Art Museum. And then Royce came back to Boise. And in the years, say 1922 to 1928, he spent most of the summers during those years in the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. And he would start the summer by walking with 2 burros up to the Sawtooth, and spend the summer in the Sawtooth, trekking about and painting. In 1928, this is an interesting slide, because this shows him when sometime in the 1920s, in his stone dugout that he dug, which actually is, and Henry can correct me on this. Henry took me down to this site several years ago. It's probably about a mile or so from Teeter's Knoll. And this is kind of what was left from Teeter's dugout on the bank of the Snake River. And the only thing that's left in it, other than the rocks, is that iron door from his stove. But then in 1928, he first went to Jackson Hole, where he spent summers for essentially the next 50 years in this painting in the Tetons, like in Jackson Hole. Archie was an enormously prolific artist. I can personally account for the whereabouts, obviously not my own paintings, although I do have a number of upwards of 4,000 of his paintings. And my estimate is that he did at least double that quantity, of the order of 8,000 paintings. This is a painting that we're looking at now. This is a painting that was done in the Hagerman Valley of the house and a water wheel. And he did many of his paintings were done in the Hagerman Valley, but also a great number of them were done in the Sawtooth. This painting here was done in 1941, just shortly after Pearl Harbor. And it shows, it's called A Sheep Herder and his dog. And it probably is it's a generic setting, probably in the Owyhee Plateau, or in the Owyhee and very southwestern Idaho. This is another of a very typical type of painting that Archie did of Idaho. This is a Stockman's Club in Ketchum, Idaho. And it was painted probably about 1935 to 1937. And then another of his paintings, I think that should be coming up, will be oh yes, this is one of my favorites. It actually was on the wedding invitation for my daughter's wedding and back in 2001. And it's Dance at Slavy's. Slavy's was a bar in Ketchum that was extremely popular in the 1930s, and you will notice the up at the top the mermaid. That Archie actually did that painting, and it hung in Slavy's for many years. And I personally have been trying to locate that painting for a number of years, but so far without success. Then there should be a painting coming up. This is that shows this sawtooth. This is Old Stanley, kind of what Old Stanley looked like, almost certainly in the early 1930s. And this is at the north end of the sawtooth. Then there should be a painting that shows, this is titled Dust Storm, another fairly typical type of painting that Archie did. And this probably is in an area fairly close to King Hill, east of Boise, probably not too far away from, well, now seeing the mountains in the background, is probably more of a generic painting. But then another painting that I certainly want to, should be here is a logging camp. In 1967, in the winter of 1967, Archie took it upon himself to paint upwards of 24 or more of primarily mining scenes, but he also did this painting of a logging camp. This would be typical of the logging camps that he worked in when he was a teenager in Idaho. And he made an effort in this painting to show essentially everything that went on, that was used in terms of what went on and in terms of the tools and the like that in logging camps. And I think next should be this is one of the upwards of 24 mining scenes, mines and mining scenes that Archie did in 1967. And the purpose of this was to capture what mining in the teens and early 1920s of what mining was like in southern Idaho. And these paintings are an extremely good resource for the history of mining and early history of mining in Idaho. Then I think there should be coming up a slide, and this is a mining camp. This is what a generic painting of mining of a mining camp along the Snake River in the Hageman Valley, of what it was like in the teens, that is between 1910 and 1920. And this is actually a very autobiographical painting, because in the middle of the Snake, you will see that there is a boat, and that really is Teeter's father and his brothers, and they are capturing what was then just absolutely gigantic sturgeon. And the sturgeon were then caught, and then in over toward the left side of the painting, you will see a wagon with sturgeon in the back. Archie has put himself in the wagon, and the sturgeon were then subsequently sold to the mining camp for food for the miners. Now I see the next painting. We jump to Jackson Hole. And in 1928, Archie made his first visit to Jackson Hole in a Ford. I'm not sure whether it was a Model T or a Model A. I think it was a Model A. And that was 1928 that he made his first visit. And he subsequently then spent virtually every summer for the next 50 years in Jackson Hole. And during much of the latter part of that, he had his own studio there. And he, among other things, he painted many Jackson town scenes. And the title of this would be Jackson on Saturday Night. And this is, for those of you that know Jackson, this is now Broadway. This is Broadway running to into Jackson, looking into the south side of the Jackson Town Square. Okay, and this is just a fairly typical genre scene of Archie's. In the slide just before this, could you go back to that, Chelsea? This is one of Archie's, probably for locals in Jackson and Jackson Hole, is probably one of his best known paintings. It was for years in the Jackson drugstore, and I'm happy to say it is back in the Jackson drugstore now, although it's not a drugstore, it is a restaurant. But it shows during World War II, when it was decided that the government did not want to feed so many elk in the wintertime, there was an elk massacre, and this is Archie's painting of, so to speak, what he called the elk massacre. What's next, Chelsea?
So Lester, we're getting a little tight on time. Is there something you want me to jump to that you want to make sure that folks see, or?
Okay, quickly, this is showing those of you that know the movie Shane. Shane was shot in Jackson Hole. This is the frontier town in Shane. This is another essentially genre painting. This is showing the Mormon settlers along Mormon Row in Jackson Hole, keeping the elk out of their hayfields. And this shows Archie's whimsical side, his really fun side. One Saturday night, he was out for a walk, and there were two ladies from the cowboy bar. They got into a fight. They took their fight out into the Jackson Town Square, and this is Archie's painting of this. Maybe we can save. Oh, I gotta say something about this. As I mentioned, Archie had 2 winters of training at the Portland Art Museum in the mid-1930s. He studied for 3 winters at the Art Students League in New York, and again he did studied there during the World War II winters. In 1938, he did this painting of what southern Manhattan looked like, and that's the Brooklyn Bridge. And we can save other things till later, Chelsea.
Okay, are there any that you want to make sure that you talk about? Or I'm just flipping through really quickly. Archie traveled the world and got to paint in a lot of places, so that's kind of what I'm skimming over.
Okay, back up to one more. One back up one more. Okay, he loved Paris, and starting in 1958, Archie and Patricia traveled into more than 100 countries, and they spent much of the winter for the last 20 years of their lives in those 100 countries, more than 100 countries. Archie painted in every one. And there was the Seine, nighttime on the Seine was shown, Kabul in Afghanistan. That's the nighttime along on the Seine. And this is Kabul in Afghanistan. And I think the next one is the Opera House in Sydney. Then I'll keep the rest till later. Thank you, Chelsea.
So are we going to turn it over to Henry now?
Oh, yes, by all means.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so Henry can talk a little bit about himself and how he kind of got to Teeter's Knoll. Yeah, Henry, whenever you're ready.
Okay, can you see me now? All right. Welcome to Teeter's Knoll. I'm sitting at the dining room table here as I am talking to you. I first learned of the Teeter Studio in 1974 when I was in college from a book called The Architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright by William Allen Storer. It was the first book published that had photographs of all of Wright's extant work, including the Teeter Studio. I was born and raised in Midland, Michigan, where my great uncle, Alden Dow, had designed our house and over 100 buildings in the town of 30,000 residents. Alden was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright in 1933, the first year of Wright's Taliesin Fellowship, his school for young architects. Alden was my close friend and mentor until his death in 1983. The Teeter Studio was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1952, at the same time he was working on the Guggenheim Museum in New York. He was certainly America's most famous architect at this time, and it's hard to imagine an architect of his stature today, if there even was one, taking on a job as small as an 1,800 square foot, one-room artist studio in rural Idaho, for which he was eventually paid $1,500. In the spring of 1968, our family first came to Sun Valley for a ski vacation. We all loved it immediately as it got us out of dreary Michigan winters and into the sun. We came back every spring for 10 years until my parents retired to Sun Valley, and I moved there as well to help with the design and construction of their house. Because of my interest in Wright, I immediately sought out the Teeter Studio, which I first saw in 1977. When I purchased the studio in 1982, I knew of it only through the connection with Frank Lloyd Wright. It has been one of the great joys of my life to learn about Archie and Patricia Teeter through their friends and acquaintances, as well as the documents found at Teeter's Knoll. Okay, could we go to the first slide then? This is a photograph of Teeter's Knoll that was taken just as it was nearing completion. And it gives you an idea of the site. This was probably taken in about 1957 or 58, I'm gonna guess. And you can see the Snake River beyond and above this studio, and its site at the lower end of the Hagerman Valley. And the road that runs in front of it was Old Highway 30, which at the time of the construction of the Teeter Studio was the main east-west road in southern Idaho. And over the past however many years, it really hasn't changed much, except it has probably less traffic now. Okay, next slide. This is a little bit closer view taken a little bit later that shows the studio from the south. And you see those little trees that are just above the retaining wall. Those have now grown to be about 40 feet tall. And the whole studio is, the whole property at Teeter's Knoll is has mature vegetation all around. The river is on the left-hand side below that wall. There's a 200-foot cliff that leads straight down to the river plain, and then the river is perhaps a quarter mile away. Next slide. This is a picture of Archie sitting on his patio wall with the studio nearly complete. And I'm guessing that all of that rock that you can see piled up is going to be the flagstone patio that they built. Now, what's important to notice in this picture are the windows of the main studio room behind Archie's back, and how the window sills slope parallel to the plane of the roof. They are not horizontal, and that has quite a profound effect when you get inside the studio. The higher roof, the clear story roof and above Archie is where the bathroom and the kitchen are, as well as a small storage workshop, and the high masonry is the fireplace chimney. Next slide. This is the inside of the studio as it looked when the Teeters lived there. And those three chairs that you see in the middle are the dining room chairs that have been moved to create a little bit of a scene here, a little arrangement. And you see the paintings up on the above there. I believe that the big one might be Custer's Last Stand, but Lester'd have to confirm that. But their collection of books. And on the left side of the upper shelf, you'll see a portrait of a person, and that is Frank Lloyd Wright. Next slide. Here is Archie painting. This is where he painted in the studio. In front of him, closer to me, is the dining room table, and I guess you would probably say I'm sitting in that chair right now that you're looking at the back of on the left-hand side of the picture. But Archie had his easel always set up at the very north end of the studio, and that was where he painted. Now the dining chairs, the dining table, and much of the furniture at Teeter's Knoll was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Here you can see how the windows slope upwards. The curtains, I have since removed these curtains. The Teeters were very paranoid about the studio being broken into, and so they had these curtains that they could pull when they were not in residence. The light fixtures above the dining room table, I'm guessing, were designed by Pat Teeter, but certainly not Frank Lloyd Wright. Next slide. This is Archie's painting of the inside of the studio. He painted it numerous times, but this gives a little sense of how it was arranged, and much of this furniture was there when I got there. The large sofa on the front right and the sofa back against the window, the green sofa, and the large globe was not here. That had been taken away. You can also see the brightly colored ottomans. They're hexagonal ottomans that were in the studio, are still in the studio. Next slide. I will skip this because this again is my picture of Lester's, that Lester talked about, the dugout that was about a mile upstream of Teeter's Knoll that still looks like this. Next slide. This is what is called the Bootlegger Shack, and this was where Archie bought this from a pair of bootleggers who had used it as a still during Prohibition years, and they built it using the native rock, and used the spring water for distilling their alcohol. And it's kind of an interesting thing, but he bought it from them and fixed it up and made it into a house. And you see a couple of things here. You see the red rocks on the top of the chimney are sort of his sort of puckish sense of humor, and the curved ridge line of the main studio room or the main room of the house is also his work. But this building still exists. It's near the mouth of the Malad Canyon. Next slide. Here is a wonderful picture that shows the man on the left in the picture is Robert Pond, who is this apprentice that Frank Lloyd Wright sent to supervise the construction of the studio. The man in the middle is Kent Hale, who is the mason who's laying the first stone on the studio, and the man on the right is Archie, of course. Kent Hale is probably the second most important artist in terms of the construction of Teeter's Knoll to its designer. His rock work is some of the finest rock work done in any Frank Lloyd Wright house. The specifications called for it to follow the pattern of the rock at Falling Water in Pennsylvania, the famous Kaufman house that sits over the waterfall, and it has horizontally laid rock that makes it look as though it naturally grows out of its site. This rock is Oakley stone, and it came from the town of Oakley where Kent grew up. And he essentially opened the quarry to build Teeter's Knoll, and it has just some of the finest rock work as well as some of the finest Oakley stone as well in the rock. And Kent came back to work for me on 2 separate occasions. So he worked here in 1953, in 1983, and then again in 1998 when he was in his late 70s. He was a remarkable friend, and I was very fortunate to know him. Next slide. Here are Archie and Pat sitting up on the window as the window frames have just gone up. And I show this because they were very much hands-on when they were building the studio. They may have had their difficulties, and she in particular was a difficult client for Wright to have to deal with. And he eventually washed his hands of the project. And it is truly remarkable. It got finished as closely to his design as it did without any supervision from apprentices or with Wright's participation. Next slide. Here is Pat up on the roof varnishing some of the fascia boards they're in the background on the right-hand side of the picture. And that just gives you an example of how they really did participate in the construction. Next slide. And I like this picture because this is an unknown, unnamed or unknown, I don't know who this man is, but he's holding a Teeter painting, and that is probably how he was paid for his work. Whenever the Teeters could manage it, they tried to pay laborers working on the job, not in cash, but through Teeter paintings. Next slide. This is kind of a fun story. I mentioned what a great joy it has been to meet people like Lester, and another friend who I have met earlier was Monty Later from St. Anthony, who was the friend of the Teeters through the 1960s and 70s, a close friend, and they met often in Jackson, but also the Laters came to Teeter's Knoll and met with them as well. But one day, Monty got a call from Archie, and he said, asked him if he and Bev could come over to Twin Falls and meet him, that he had something he wanted to show them. And Monty always liked to see Archie and Pat, so he agreed and met at one of those motels along Blue Lakes, Blue Lakes Boulevard. And when they got there, there was this bright orange Porsche, a 911 under the porte cochere, and Monty kind of took a look at it and noted it, and then walked inside the lobby, and there was Archie, and I can't remember exactly what part of his outfit was the same color, but he was also wearing orange. and Archie was just beyond himself with excitement, and anyway, he said, "Come on out here, Monty, I have to show you something." And they got in the car, and Archie sat in the driver's seat and Monty was in the passenger seat, and Archie reaches up and pats the dashboard of the Porsche, and he says, one painting. And what he meant was he paid for the Porsche with the sale of one painting. And that was when Archie knew he had really made it as an artist. Next page. This is how Teeter's Knoll looked when I first got here. And the carport is on the right, and the front door is the left center. And you see that TV antenna thing on the left-hand side of the picture that is supporting a 15-foot cantilever. And that was not part of Wright's design, but then Wright didn't include a way to support that roof properly. And so that was one of the things that I had to deal with when I got here. The clear story roof you can see as well. Next slide. This is the view that I first saw of Teeter's Knoll as I looked over the road. And you see the diagonal knee brace that supports the cantilever of what we call the prow. And the prow is a 35-foot cantilever. And again, Wright hadn't specified as to how that was to be supported, and that they ended up putting that knee brace there, which really bothered my eye when I first saw it. You can see the blackout curtains in the studio. But the very first thing I did after I bought it was to take the barbed wire down from the fence there. That really bothered me, and that was the first thing that got changed. Next slide. This was what it looked like probably in the summer of 1982, shortly after I had purchased it. And we turned the whole studio into a wood shop and put those fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling and the various saws and equipment. What we were doing here is replacing all of the 105 pieces of glass in the studio with thermopane. It was all single pane glass, and it had condensed on the inside and stained all of the wood. And that was something that really bothered me. So we replaced it with thermopane. It was a project that took at least 6 months to do, and really didn't change the general view of the studio that much, although it sure made it look beautiful. Next slide. These are the two floor plans that I drew for my first book that I wrote about Teeter's Knoll. And the upper floor plan is Wright's original design, and that's the way it looked when I got the studio. It is basically a one-room studio. The bedroom is actually just a partitioned off area of the main studio. The fireplace is at the heart of the house, which is very typical of a Frank Lloyd Wright house. But what bothered me tremendously was the workspace, which is Frank Lloyd Wright's word for kitchen, and the bathroom are two rectangular spaces that are stuck in the middle of this beautiful geometry that's created by these equilateral parallelograms. Wright typically laid out a floor plan using a grid like this. It's somewhat like a staff in music, and the notes of the music are comparable to the pillars and the walls or whatever. It's a very musical sort of architecture. So on the lower plan, you can see that I have moved the kitchen back into that workshop that was pretty much abandoned when I got there, and then expanded the bathroom. And that was the second major facet of the project. And in the lower right-hand corner is where the bunkhouse is, which I believe I have a picture of later, that I designed and built that area. Next slide. This is what Teeter's Knoll looks like today from down near Snake River Pottery, looking up at the studio. You can see the cliff below it, and you also can see the prow projecting out, And the wood that is kind of illuminated there is the cladding that we did to cover up that diagonal knee brace, which is still there, but you just can't see it. Next slide. And here it is from directly across the river. You can see what a beautiful piece of organic architecture this is. Organic meaning it grows out of the site and feels like a part of the site, which is very much the way, was a very important part of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. Next slide. And this is the view from underneath the prow. There you can get a much better sense of how we basically extended the lines of the window sills through that rock mass to become this stepped detail that supports that cantilever. Next slide. And this is the view looking towards the front door. In 1998, my late wife Lynn and I enclosed the carport, and you can see the carport is right close in this view, and the rock walls there are where the car would have driven in, and you literally would have had to have a Porsche or a car. The Teeters originally had a Carmen Ghia in order to get it in that carport. There's no way a pickup truck could fit in, but it now serves as office and storage for us. And that wall that's closest to you is Kent Hale's last wall. He did that in 1998 in his late 70s. Just a remarkable story. Next slide. This is the interior now looking back towards the front door and showing the large beam that supports the whole roof coming out of the fireplace and leading to the front. This beam was actually put in place by Archie and Vardis Fisher. Together, the two of them using two hay derricks raised this beam into place. And it had been in the lumber yard in Wendell for a few months. The Teeters hadn't paid their bill, and the lumberman had said that he would rather see that beam get made into matchsticks than have the Teeters get it. And so they asked their friend Vardis if he would go over and purchase it and bring it to them. It's 12 inches wide by 18 inches high by 46 feet long. And after they got it put into place, the Teeters paid Vardis with 2 bottles of whiskey. Next slide. This is looking basically in the opposite direction towards the prow. And you can see the window seat was the way Wright designed it, and those chairs in the picture are called Origami Chairs, and they were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, but never put in the studio. But the drawings were there, so we built 3 of them. And the sculptures on the right-hand side of the picture and those lanterns are the work of my late wife, Lynn Fawcett Whiting. She was a sculptor, and we were married in the house, and she lived there for 20 years before passing away about 5 years ago in the studio. And she was a very gifted person and a very integral part of the saving of Teeter's Knoll. Next slide. This is the view of the river, and this is from the bunkhouse deck, and it gives you a sense of the connection with the river and how close it is. This rapid, of course, is called Frank Lloyd Wright Rapid, and it's part of the Hagerman Reach of the Snake, which is commercially rafted, and we frequently hear screams of people coming through the rapid. Like that through there. What doesn't show unless you're there or doesn't hear is the sound. The sound of the river is very loud, and it permeates the whole studio, the whole property. Next slide. This is one of my favorite pictures of Archie and Pat Teeter at the studio. Gives you a sense of the great kindness of Archie. I never knew him, but I I wish I did, especially when you see a picture like this. And that concludes my slides, but I would just like to say one thing quickly, is that many people want to come see the studio, and it just isn't possible for me to accommodate everybody who wants to come here individually. But what I want to say is that every June, the Hagerman Valley Historical Society we have a benefit tour, and people come to Hagerman and have lunch in the park, and then they come out and tour Teeter's Knoll. And we're trying to raise money and awareness to build a museum for the Historical Society, which will in part be dedicated to Archie Teeter. And I would welcome you to all sign up for that, or hopefully we can do it this coming year. We weren't able to do it last year, but we've done it in early June, which celebrates Frank Lloyd Wright's birthday in general. So in any case, thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. I'm just going to talk really briefly about my experience with Archie Teeter and his archival collection. I first learned of Archie Teeter in February 2019 when my colleague and I at the Idaho State Archives were working on an Instagram post. This is a screenshot of the post. And before we dug out these photos, I had never heard of Archie Teeter, but I had heard of Frank Lloyd Wright, who I studied in high school, and I was a huge fan, I guess you can say, of his work. And so when I learned Archie's connection to Frank Lloyd Wright, I wanted to work on this manuscript photo collection. And when I started working on it, the collection was unprocessed. So that means it wasn't organized. It was a lot of papers kind of just dumped or put into boxes in no specific order. So if you were looking for something in the collection, you would have to look through every box because we didn't know where things were. There were about 25 boxes in the Archie Teeter collection at the Idaho State Archives. And I went through every single one, and I put my grubby hands, not really, they were clean, but I put my hands on every single document in that collection and organized the collection into something that researchers can use and easily find documents in. And that took a little over a year. The cool thing about the Archie and Patricia Teeter collection is that it has all kinds of documents. There's correspondence, letters, receipts, furniture catalogs. And here's an example. Patricia, Archie's wife, kept a lot of these little tiny diaries. On the left side of the screen, you can see, one sitting in my hand for scale. And I have big hands, but they're just little diaries. And on the right, you can see where I've gone through and made folders for each of those little tiny diaries so that you can find what you're looking for. This, like I said, there's a lot of cool stuff in the Teeter collection at the Idaho State Archives. And this is a letter to the Teeters from Frank Lloyd Wright, signed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And like I said, being a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright in high school, I saw this letter and I burst into tears, and there were other people in the room, and it was kind of weird, but it was such a cool experience. And as Henry mentioned, getting to know the Teeters and the other people in this community has been amazing. It really is a joy. Early this year, I transitioned from the Idaho State Archives to the Idaho State Museum, where I now help care for artifacts. And it just so happened there was a box of Teeter related artifacts that were waiting to be processed and, put into proper packaging and those kinds of things and be stored. So on the right-hand side is one of the Teeter artifacts I got to work with. It's a lay figure or a mannequin of a horse, that an artist would have used to create an image of a horse. And on the left is a sketch of horses, right, from the Teeter collection. So you can see how Archie was using these artifacts that are at the State Museum and kind of how that materialized in the archival collection at the Idaho State Archives. And this last one, this is a palette knife. There are many paintbrushes of all different sizes that are part of the Teeter collection at the Idaho State Museum, and a bunch of palette knives. And everything is really fun because it's all covered in paint. This particular palette knife is really cool because, as you can see in that image in the bottom, he has carved, Archie Teeter has carved his name into the palette knife. So, you know, it just shows, you know, his connection to those artifacts. As I mentioned, I spent over a year processing that archival collection at the Idaho State Archives. It's available to the public if you want to go in and research. There is a very large finding aid, which kind of tells you what is in the collection at a folder level. Like I said, there are about 25 boxes. And that's kind of been the culmination of my work. But I'm so thankful for this opportunity and to get to talk about Archie and to listen to Lester and Henry talk about Archie. So thank you both so much. I think we can turn it over to David for questions.
Yes. Yeah, if you'll kind of stop sharing your screen for a moment. Oh, and they've got some, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, very quickly. If you have any questions and you want to contact us, there's my email, and there's Lester's phone number and email. As Henry mentioned, he lives in Teeter's Knoll. So don't show up to his house and ask for a tour. Please be respectful of his space. But yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Chelsea, Lester, and Henry. Greatly appreciated all that wonderful knowledge. We have just a couple questions, and that's, you know, don't have much time, so I'll go ahead and ask these. The first one, are prints of Archie's paintings available for sale? If so, where?
Unfortunately, no. There occasionally are Archie's paintings that become available on eBay and elsewhere, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not very often anymore. But as I mentioned, he was enormously prolific, and the place to see Archie's paintings now is for the most part is at the Historical Museum Society Museum in Hagerman Valley. There's also a large number of his, substantial number of his paintings in Jackson Hole, and the public can see them at what is called the drugstore, which is a restaurant, but a good number of his paintings are available there. Also, I have a substantial collection of his paintings myself, and I do enjoy showing them to people. But unfortunately, as far as I know, no prints of his paintings are available.
Thank you. Thank you. Somebody asked, will this program be made accessible for a time? Absolutely. This is being recorded, and we will, it'll be available on our website, which is idahohumanitiescouncil.org. Time for two more questions. The first one, this is for you, Henry. After nearly 40 years of being present at Teeter's Knoll, please tell us some thoughts and feelings that occur now on a daily basis regarding your relationship with the house and its placement in the environment.
Well, that's a good question. That's a hard one to answer shortly, but I will just say that I observe, I'll take a step back. Frank Lloyd Wright homeowners will inevitably tell you, and almost every one of them will say this, that they see something new in their house every day. And it's one of the great things about it. I agree with that. And what I would say is that what one sees basically is the relationship with the architecture and nature. And in recent years, I've just been observing this, like you say, for 40 years, but interestingly, I find myself, especially in the afternoon, the light inside the studio. This is a painter's studio, remember, so the light is just fantastic. And in the afternoon, as the late sun starts coming in and it comes through those windows and it comes through the leaves on the trees, and the shadows will sort of dance on the floor. And it's the most remarkable thing. So I essentially find myself turning in towards the house instead of looking out at nature and seeing the sunset. And the other thing I would say, I discovered this many years ago, but what happens late in the day too is that the sun will reflect off the surface of the Snake River, and it will project itself onto the ceiling of the studio, and it will be brightly lit. And actually, some days, if it's just right, you can actually see the water, the surface of the water projected onto the ceiling, and you can actually see it moving. And what's interesting is because it comes through the window prism somewhat, like it actually is flowing in the opposite direction on the roof that it is flowing on the floor. And these kind of magical things just come from spending enough time at the studio. Of course, I didn't realize that whole projection thing on the ceiling for about 20 years. And it makes you feel kind of like, what were you doing for those first 20 years that you didn't notice it? Because now it's so obvious. But those kind of secrets keep revealing themselves. And it's one of the great spaces I've ever been in. And it's one of the lesser known buildings, but it's one of the great interiors. It's just full of diagonal lines. It's for an artist. It's a place for creation. It's not a house that's meant to be reposeful. It's meant to be somewhat agitating and to inspire creativity.
Thank you so much, Henry. And our last question is for you, Chelsea. Are there plans to feature Teeter in any upcoming exhibits?
Hopefully. I have been advocating for an exhibit about Teeter and his life at the museum for a while now. So hopefully, fingers crossed.
Can I add something here?
Yeah.
There is planned for this coming summer for the Jackson Hole Historical Museum in Jackson for a full summer of Teeter, Teeter paintings and Archie Teeter. It was originally planned for this past summer, but it obviously had to be postponed. So that is in the works, and there will be an extremely good collection of Teeter's paintings there.
Thank you so much for that. And Chelsea, Lester, and Henry, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It was beautiful. I've seen several comments of people just saying thank you for opening up Teeter's Knoll, to us, and for sharing all those wonderful paintings, and for Chelsea for your dedication in preserving his legacy at the Idaho State Archives. We're going to take a break next week for the Thanksgiving holiday, but please join us on December the 1st when our next connected conversation will be on the history of Wallace. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
It's Chelsea.
Thank you.